I married Elena Marsh because I loved her. Everyone who looked at us saw something else. They saw a quiet man with no last name worth remembering, standing beside a woman whose family could buy cities. They saw a transaction. I let them believe it, because the truth would have put a target on her back the size of the whole sky. My name is not what anyone thinks it is. My inheritance is not what anyone imagines. And the woman sleeping in the room next to mine, behind a door she has never once opened from my side, has no idea I loved her long before either of us agreed to this arrangement. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. Everything that follows is built on it. My name is Adrian Vane. I was 22 the first time I saw her, and I have not drawn an honest breath since. The forum was held in a converted theater in the old quarter, the kind of building where the ceiling leaks when it rains. She was the third speaker. The first two were men in dark suits who read from cards and asked for applause they hadn't earned. Elena walked to the podium with a binder of notes she had clearly written herself. Before she said a word, she leaned over the microphone and told the technician, "I don't need this. I'll speak loudly enough." People laughed. She smiled, opened the binder, glanced at it once, then set it on the ledge and never touched it again. She talked about a food bank her family funded in the eastern districts, not the way a donor talks about a line item, but the way someone talks about a place they've actually stood inside at 5 in the morning when the first truck arrives. Her fingers gripped the sides of the podium. She was nervous. She didn't hide it, and she didn't perform around it either. 20 minutes in, she stumbled. The line was about dignity, how a person doesn't lose it by accepting help, only by being denied it. She tripped on the word dignity, and for half a second the room went still. She stopped. Looked straight into the crowd. "I said that wrong," she said. "Let me say it again. Louder." She said it again, louder, and didn't stumble. The room exhaled. People in the front row clapped, charmed, the way people are generous when someone has been brave enough to be small in front of them. I was in the back row. I didn't clap. I sat there with my hands on my knees and forgot, for a moment, how to close my mouth. I had listened to diplomats, board chairs, people trained from childhood to command a room exactly like this one. None of them had ever made me forget to breathe. She did it by being bad at something and refusing to hide it. I walked out of that theater knowing two things with absolute certainty: I loved her, and I could never tell her. Not yet. I didn't even know her name, I had to check the lobby board to find it. When I saw it printed beside a family I'd spent my life being taught to fear, I understood that loving her wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that gets people hurt. My own family's name was not something I wore. It was sealed in a vault beneath a house I couldn't yet claim, locked away by my grandmother, Elena Vane, before she died. She had watched her own husband destroyed by the same forces that later came for my father, and she decided, before I was even born, that I would not be destroyed the same way. Her instructions were specific: I would be raised outside the family's orbit. Ordinary school. Ordinary name. Ordinary life, until I was strong enough to surface the real one without being torn apart by people who'd been waiting for it to resurface. I honored that. I took contract accounting jobs, rented small apartments, learned to be invisible in rooms where other people needed to be seen. And I waited. Not for power. For her. When the Marsh family announced they were seeking a match for Elena, it wasn't about love. Speculation about their holdings had reached the financial press, and a public marriage was the cleanest way to quiet it. They needed a husband who wouldn't complicate the board, wouldn't bring his own faction, visible enough for the cameras, quiet enough to never speak. They needed a no one. I made myself available to be exactly that. The match was arranged through an old lawyer named Mercer, who knew pieces of who I really was and had, I believe, been paid by my grandmother's estate for years to watch for exactly this kind of opportunity. I was presented as a man of modest income with no significant family. No one asked the obvious question, why a man with nothing would be considered at all. They assumed I'd been vetted. I had been. Just not by them. The first time I sat across from Elena's mother, Constance Marsh, she looked at me the way one looks at a convenient piece of furniture. "Do you owe money?" she asked. "No." "Have you ever been photographed with anyone whose name might embarrass this family?" "No." She didn't ask a third question. She turned to Mercer. "Fine. Set the date." Elena's father, Edmund Marsh, shook my hand once at the engagement dinner and never again. He wasn't cruel, he was exhausted, his health already failing in ways no one discussed, and he'd handed his daughter's life over to his brother and his wife years ago. That brother, Elena's uncle, Walter Marsh, controlled the estate and the board. He called me the husband, always with the same flat weight, as though I were a category rather than a person. He was the kind of man who installed listening devices in his own home because he trusted his family less than he trusted strangers. I'd learn that later. And then there was Renner Doyle. Renner wasn't blood. His father had been Walter's business partner for 30 years, and Renner had grown up half-raised inside the Marsh house, summers at the lake, Christmas mornings, a chair that was always his at every family table. He and Elena had been pushed toward each other since childhood, the way families with money push their children toward convenient alliances, calling it tradition because promise sounded too transactional even for them. He smiled at me across the dessert table the way a man smiles at a joke he intends to enjoy telling later, at length, to people who matter. I smiled back. I gave him nothing, because giving him anything would have ended the only chance I had of staying near her. 40 guests, none of them mine, I'd been told to invite none. Elena stood across from me in a dress that cost more than most people's homes and said words she'd been told to say. I said words I'd been waiting my whole adult life to say. She didn't hear a single one of them as anything but formality. I knew she wouldn't. I said them anyway. At the reception, measured, brief, no dancing, she thanked me. You've been gracious about all this. You don't need to thank me. I do. I know this isn't what you'd have chosen for yourself. She was wrong. I let her be wrong. That night, in the suite, she sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress and told me, with careful, rehearsed kindness, that she understood this was an arrangement. That she respected me. That she hoped, in time, we could be friends. I don't expect anything from you that you don't wish to give, she said. I know you agreed to this for practical reasons. I won't hold that against you. I told her I understood. I told her I was grateful. I told her I'd do everything I could to make it easy for her. I did not tell her I'd understood for years, since before she even knew my face, that loving her would cost me becoming someone she'd never recognize, and that I'd agreed to pay that cost in advance, for the rest of my life, if it meant she was safe. She nodded, relieved. The relief on her face was the relief of a person being kind to a stranger. I was not a stranger. I couldn't tell her. Her kindness landed on me like a door closing. We moved into the East Wing. 2 bedrooms, 1 shared hallway. Staff had been told, in no uncertain terms, not to spend extra time on the husband's side. I polished the floor myself, on my knees, the first afternoon, while Elena was at a board meeting. She came home. Noticed the brighter wood, and said nothing. I think she assumed I was being frugal. I was being protective. There were listening devices in that house I hadn't located yet, and conversations I couldn't let anyone overhear, conversations with Mercer, with a retired judge named Hollister, with myself, in the small hours, planning how I'd eventually dismantle the people who would try to take her. Someone always tries to take people like her. So I played the part. The grateful husband. The man who poured her coffee before she asked, because I'd learned how she took it years earlier, from interviews, from one overheard conversation at a charity auction. She never asked how I knew. Slowly, she began to tolerate me. Then trust me, the careful way a person trusts a stranger whose politeness has lasted long enough to start looking like character. She told me about her headaches after long board meetings, hidden from her mother because Constance treated illness as weakness. She told me about her younger brother, failing his exams, and how she was secretly paying a tutor because their mother refused. She told me these things in the kitchen, in the garden, in the small in-between moments marriages are actually made of. I listened the way she'd never been listened to, full attention, no redirecting, no solutions she hadn't asked for. She never knew that every word she gave me, I'd already fought years to earn the right to hear. Renner came every Sunday. He walked through that house like it was already his. He spoke to Elena in the shorthand of shared childhood, and she answered in the same language, because to her, that's exactly what he was, family, in every way but blood. He spoke to me only to remind the room I didn't belong. What was it you said you did again, he'd ask, already grading the answer he intended to fail. Elena watched me during those dinners, studying, like a person staring at a wall trying to decide if there's something behind it. She never asked. I think she was afraid of the answer either way, that if there was nothing behind it, she'd married a hollow man, and if there was something, she'd married a liar. 6 months in, the family called a private meeting I wasn't invited to. I learned of it because Adler, the housekeeper who'd served the estate for 30 years, slipped a folded note into my coat pocket inside a dry cleaning receipt. 3 words, Thursday. Library. Divorce. I read it standing in the foyer mirror, coat still on, and understood the thing I'd been preparing for had begun. Walter had called the meeting at Constance's insistence. They wanted Elena to file before the year turned. Renner would step in. The board would stabilize. The name would stay close to the bloodline. She'd been told, at that meeting, that I'd taken money from a man named Hollis, a distant investor who'd been quietly buying shares in the family's holding company for 2 years and had, in fact, approached me 3 months earlier with an offer I'd refused and reported to no one. Because reporting it would mean explaining how I knew Hollis was a threat. And explaining that would mean showing her the accounts. And the accounts would expose who I really was. A lie built around a real grain. The kind that works. That night she came to my door. Didn't knock. Stood in the hallway, arms folded. Did you take money from anyone connected to my family? No. She studied me. I could see she wanted to believe me, and that wanting frightened her. Have you ever met the man they named? Yes. When? 3 months ago. Where? A cafe near the river. What did he want? Influence inside your family. I told him no. She stood there a long time. I wish you'd told me about the meeting, she said quietly. I wish I had too. Neither of us said anything else. She left. The door closed. I sat on the edge of my bed and understood the lie was going to work, not because it was true, but because I couldn't fight it without showing her the thing I'd sworn to keep hidden. I started taking longer contract jobs in the city. Staying out in the evenings, when her mother was most likely to call and Renner was most likely to visit. I needed to be absent so the family would relax, so they'd stop watching closely enough to notice me moving against them in the quiet they didn't think I was capable of. Because I was moving. I had allies they didn't know existed. Mercer, the lawyer, had served my grandmother for 30 years and held the sealed documents that would surface the name and the inheritance the moment I gave the word. Hollister, a retired judge, owed his career to my family's support, decades before the name was buried, and had been waiting since to repay it. And a young forensic accountant named Calla, placed years ago by my grandmother's estate inside the very firm that handled the Marsh family's books, overlooked, because she was young and worked in a department no one important bothered to watch. I didn't ask any of them to move yet. I kept telling myself there was a version of this that didn't end in war. I was wrong, but not knowing it kept me gentle for months longer than I should have been. Renner escalated. He started appearing at Elena's office with flowers, with documents she needed to sign, with invitations to events that were, conveniently, for two. He waited for her in the lobby every morning for a week, rode the elevator up with her, talked about the lake house, about summers, about plans their families had once made. She told me about some of it over dinner, watching for a reaction. I asked about the food. The venue. I didn't ask if she was considering him. She took my silence as proof of what she'd already suspected, that I felt nothing beyond convenience. She was wrong. Her being wrong widened the distance between us, because naming a distance makes it real, and a real distance is something a family can point to. I found the second listening device in the library, behind a painting of Walter's father that had hung in the same spot for 40 years. Then a third, in the dining room chandelier, newer, the kind Renner would have had planted during one of his Sunday visits, when the staff were used to him walking through the house like he owned it. I dismantled them slowly and replaced each with a dead replica so no one would notice the silence. I kept the recordings in a metal box beneath my closet floorboards. I didn't use them yet. I still wanted to believe there was a version of this that didn't require it. On a rainy Thursday 3 weeks later, Elena came home late. I was in the kitchen, making tea I didn't need, because the kettle gave my hands something to do. She stood in the doorway, soaked, coat dark at the shoulders. My family wants me to leave you, she said. I'm starting to think they might be right. She set her bag down. I tried to think of a reason to stay the whole drive home. The only one I could find is that you make good coffee. That's not a reason. That's an embarrassment. She looked at me. I never asked why you married me. I think I was afraid of the answer. I'm asking now. The silence lasted too long. I married you because I had no good reason to say no, I said. And because saying yes seemed to help you. I haven't found a reason to regret it. She looked at me the way a person looks at a locked door they'd hoped was open. Is that the whole truth? Yes. Thank you for your honesty, she said, and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen until the tea went cold and the rain stopped, understanding I'd just chosen, again, to protect her at the cost of her trust and that the cost was compounding. Renner arranged a sailing weekend family, plus a few investors, the kind of guest list that made the trip look like business. I wasn't invited. Go, I told her. Enjoy it. The house will be quiet without you. I'll read. The garden needs work. I'll be fine. She stood at the door a moment too long, waiting for something I didn't give her, because giving it meant telling her everything, and I wasn't ready. I watched from the upstairs window as the car pulled away. Then I called Mercer. In his cluttered office in the north, the kind of place that looks forgotten by the world, exactly as my grandmother intended, he laid out the sealed will, the trust documents, the proof I was the only living heir. The moment you do this, he said, there's no going back. Her family will know you've been deceiving them. Renner will come at you with everything. And your wife will learn the man she's been slowly deciding to leave has been hiding something far bigger than anything she ever accused him of. I need more time, I told him. He looked at me the way old men look at young men who love too much respect and pity in equal measure, and said nothing. I drove back to the city in the dark, thinking about her on the boat under the stars, and Renner standing close, and I gripped the wheel until my hands ached. She came back sunburned and quiet in a way I didn't recognize. At dinner, she didn't speak for 20 minutes. I let the silence be. He proposed, she finally said. Not officially. Not to my parents. To me. On the upper deck, after dinner, while the others were below. She said Renner told her he'd loved her since they were children. That he knew she was unhappy. That he could make her happy. That all she had to do was say yes. What did you say? Nothing. I went below deck and locked the cabin. I spent the night wondering why I couldn't just say yes to a man who's, on paper, everything I should want. A man my family approves of. A man who's never lied to me about who he is. She looked at me, really looked. I don't understand why his offer felt like the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Why my silence felt like a betrayal of something. I can't explain it. It frightens me. I told her silence wasn't the same as refusal. That she owed no one an answer she didn't have yet. Why did you marry me? She asked again. I gave her, again, the answer that would hurt her less than the truth. That night I wrote a letter I didn't send. It began with her name and ended with a confession I couldn't speak aloud, the theater, the word about dignity, the coffee, the years, the choice to become a stranger so no one could use her against me. I folded it and put it in my desk drawer, telling myself the act of writing it had been enough. It hadn't. I just built another room inside myself and locked the door. Walter fell ill. The family gathered. Renner moved through the hospital with the authority of a man already assuming control, greeting nurses by name, reviewing charts he had no right to review, telling the attending physician, Dr. Reyes, that he, not Walter's wife, would be making decisions from now on. Board meetings resumed under his direction. Agenda items he'd been pushing for a year started appearing as items nobody had the energy to contest. Elena was edged out of decisions she'd once led. She came home one evening angrier than I'd ever seen her, and for the first time, she didn't hide it. They're taking everything, she said, pacing. They never meant for me to keep any of it. This marriage was the excuse they needed to call me compromised. Renner's been positioning for this since before I even met you. I listened. I didn't defend anyone. I didn't offer a plan. I let the rage be true, because it was truer than anything she'd shown me in a year. At 2 a.m, she found me in the study, reading depositions I shouldn't have had. Who are you? She asked, and her voice had no defenses left in it. The words formed in my mouth. Ready. I'm your husband, I said instead. I'm trying. She closed her eyes. Trying isn't enough anymore. She left. I listened to her footsteps go up the stairs, each one a small finality, understanding I'd just saved her and condemned myself in the same breath. Renner made his move at a public gala, 300 guests, a ballroom that cost more per night than most people's yearly rent. He took the microphone during the toast, no one had asked him to. The family is considering a restructuring of its leadership, he said, smiling, the smile never reaching his eyes. Certain personal arrangements might need to be honored anew. Everyone understood. Phones rose slowly around the room, like flowers turning toward a sun. Elena didn't flinch. She smiled the smile she'd been trained to smile since childhood, thanked him for his leadership, then turned to me. We need to talk. Tonight. I've made a decision. The car ride home was silent. In the driveway, before I cut the engine, she said it. I'm going to file for divorce. It's the kindest thing for both of us. You never wanted this. I'm sorry I made you pretend for so long. The papers will be ready next week. The settlement will be generous. I don't want to fight. She thanked me for my patience the way a person thanks a contractor for finishing a job they never wanted. I sat in the driver's seat understanding, with strange clarity, that the woman I'd loved since a stumble over the word dignity had just thanked me for pretending to love her, and that the pretending, all along, had been entirely on her side. I didn't sleep. I went inside and called Mercer. Not the divorce, I told him. The other documents. All of it. The inheritance. The name. The proof Renner had been embezzling from the estate for 7 years through a shell company registered under his own mother's maiden name. The proof Walter's illness wasn't illness at all, but a slow poisoning by a compound that mimicked cardiac decline, administered by Dr. Reyes, who had been on Renner's payroll since the year I married Elena. My voice didn't shake. I'd waited years for this call. I went to her door afterward and stood in the dark without knocking, forehead against the wood, telling myself, not for the first time, that loving her was going to cost me the one thing I'd ever wanted, for her to choose me, knowing exactly who I was. The next morning she was already dressed when I came down. She'd made coffee, she hadn't done that in months. I want to do this cleanly, she said. Without lawyers if possible. Without cruelty. Without press. I'll give you anything you need. What do you think I need? I don't know. I've never known. That's part of why I'm leaving. The coffee was bitter, too strong, made the way I made it. She'd learned that from watching me, and I realized it was, in her mind, the entirety of what she'd gathered about me in a year of marriage. I understand, I told her. I won't fight you on anything. At the kitchen door, she paused, hand on the frame. I hope, one day, you find someone who marries you for reasons that have nothing to do with arrangements. I smiled, close-lipped, the way I'd learned to keep things from showing. I didn't say what I wanted to say, that I already had. That I'd found her years before any arrangement existed, in a theater in the old quarter, when she stumbled on a word about dignity and said it again, louder. That afternoon, Renner walked into the estate uninvited and found me in the garden. I appreciate your cooperation, he said, cheerful. I know it's been a difficult year. Marrying above your station, the climb down must sting. I'll make sure you get a generous settlement. Quick, quiet. Bygones. Where do you think the money's coming from? He laughed. The family has more than enough to buy out a mistake. I let him laugh. I watched him the way you watch a man walking across ice that's already cracked beneath him. He laughed. I sat in the garden until the light turned from gold to gray, and then I went inside, and I began to move. Mercer filed the petition the next morning, not divorce papers, but a petition to the family's internal trust, naming himself an heir's representative and demanding review of Renner's management and Walter's medical care. It carried my real name, my grandmother's sealed will, the embezzlement proof, and a forensic report on Walter's treatment that Dr. Reyes never expected anyone to request. The trust's executor received it at 9. By noon, 3 board members had resigned. By evening, Renner's accounts were frozen, Dr. Reyes had been visited by 2 officers, and Walter had been transferred unconscious to a facility where the staff answered to my family's name, not his. None of this was public yet. Elena and I moved through the house like 2 figures in a painting neither of us had agreed to sit for, careful, separate, each waiting for the other to speak first. A letter arrived from Constance. Brief, pointed, why had certain accounts been flagged, why were board members calling with questions she couldn't answer, why had Dr. Reyes vanished overnight? Elena read it at the table, in front of me, and for the first time in a year looked at me with something other than distance. Do you know anything about this? I don't know what you're referring to, I said, true in the narrowest, most cowardly sense. She folded the letter. My family's been keeping secrets from me for a long time, she said. I'm starting to suspect they're not the only ones. She went upstairs without dinner. I heard her crying through the door, the small private kind a person does when they think no one can hear. I stood outside it a long time, hand raised, and didn't knock, afraid that comforting her now would be manipulation, not love. The next morning, the executor opened the sealed will. The name was out. My grandmother's estate, long assumed dissolved, was intact, protected by a clause no one in the Marsh family had thought to challenge, because no one had known a living heir remained. Renner reacted, Mercer told me, theatrically. Denied everything. Accused me of forgery. Tried to leave the country on a private flight that was, by prior arrangement with the authorities already investigating the embezzlement, denied departure. He sat in an airport lounge for 6 hours, furious, calling people who didn't answer. That evening the news reached Elena before it reached me through any other channel. A reporter called the estate's main line asking for comment on the revelation that the husband of the Marsh heiress is himself the heir to an unrelated fortune long thought extinct. She took the call in the study. I was in the next room. I heard her say, "What?" I heard the phone hit the desk. She found me in the library 20 minutes later, phone still in her hand like a weapon she didn't know how to use. Is it true? Yes. How long? All my life. Why didn't you tell me? Because telling you would have made you a target, I said. I chose to be a stranger rather than let anyone use how much you mattered to me as a weapon against you. I let you believe I was a fortune hunter because the alternative was letting the people who'd hurt you find out exactly how much you meant. She sat on the arm of the leather chair, not in it, like she didn't trust herself to commit to sitting. Did you marry me for my family's money? No. Then why? I told her the truth, for the first time since the day I forgot to breathe in the back row of a theater. I told her about the stumble, about dignity, about learning her coffee order from interviews, about polishing the hallway floor my first afternoon because I couldn't bear anyone else touching the space between our doors. I told her every silence I'd ever given her had been a silence I chose over a confession that could have ended her. She didn't move. Didn't cry. I wish you'd let me decide that for myself, she said quietly. I was afraid you'd decide wrong. And that the wrong decision would destroy your family. Maybe you, too. She stood. I need to be alone. She left without looking at me. I stood there, in the house I'd protected for her, beside the name I'd buried for her, and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what protecting her might have cost me. Articles ran the next day. None of them kind. They called her blind. They called me a schemer who'd buried his name to infiltrate a wealthy family. Renner, cornered, held a press conference and accused me of engineering the marriage as a calculated acquisition. He was sweating. His collar was wet at the throat. His smile kept slipping into something frightened. By the end, he wasn't answering questions anymore, just repeating himself. The press, who'd come expecting a villain, left with something more complicated. Constance called, frantic, demanding I retract, deny, disappear. Edmund sent one line through a lawyer, leave immediately and we will settle quietly. I didn't answer either of them. I packed a small bag and left it by the front door. I didn't leave. Renner was arrested at midnight quietly, in his apartment, by 2 officers who'd been waiting on the final forensic report. Charged with embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud the estate, and the deliberate, repeated poisoning of Walter Marsh over 18 months. Walter, alive against the odds, had been moved to a private facility, the compound slowly clearing from his blood. He'd briefly regained consciousness and asked, in a voice no one recognized, who had done this to him. None of it reached the house. Elena was upstairs, behind her door, deciding something about me that no amount of money or name had any right to influence. I sat in the study and waited, because the only thing I'd ever wanted was for her to choose freely, and now that the choice was finally hers, I was terrified of what she'd do with it. She came down at 3 a.m, still wearing the coat she'd had on for hours, like she'd meant to go somewhere and changed her mind on the stairs. She looked at the bag by the door. At the letter on the desk. Are you leaving? I haven't decided. What's the letter? Something I wrote for you months ago. Never sent. She didn't ask to read it. She sat across from me instead, in the chair she'd always preferred. I spent the whole evening trying to understand what I feel, she said. And the thing I keep coming back to isn't anger at you for hiding who you are. It's anger at myself. I never once, in all those months, asked you a question that might have led you to tell me the truth. She looked down at her hands. I decided you were a transaction because it was simpler than the alternative. Simpler than admitting I'd married a man I didn't understand, and then never tried. I called it respect. Gratitude. Habit. None of those were ever the right word. She looked up. I think I'd known the real one since the night on the boat, when I couldn't say yes to a man who was perfect on paper. I just wasn't ready to say it. I let the silence hold. I don't know if I love you, she said. But I know I've been afraid of losing you for months. And I think the divorce was my way of trying to end that fear by ending the thing causing it. That's the cruelest logic I've ever used on anyone. I'm ashamed of it. She looked at me. Is it too late? I don't know, I said. I've been asking myself the same thing since the night you stood at my door asking if I'd taken money from your family. The night I chose to protect you instead of letting you know me. I remember, she said, and closed her eyes. I'm sorry. I never needed you to be. Morning came. Neither of us had slept. Show me, she said. I showed her everything. The will. The holdings. The forensic report. The recordings pulled from the walls of her own house. The proof Renner had been listening to her for years through devices planted in the library and the dining room. The proof Walter had been poisoned by a man who dined at her table every Sunday. The proof that the family she'd spent her life pleasing had been managing her out of her own inheritance while convincing her that her powerless husband was the parasite. She read in silence. When she finished the last page, she didn't speak for a long time. Did you do all of this for me? Yes. Did you ever want the money? The name? The seat at the table they denied you? No. What did you want? I wanted you to know me, I said. I was willing to lose you to keep that from being used against you. The cost was higher than I calculated. I'd pay it again. But I'm tired of paying it. I don't want to pay it anymore. She reached across the desk and took the letter, the one I'd written months ago and never sent. She opened it and read. While I sat with nothing left to hide behind. I watched her face as the words landed. The small parting of her lips. Her hand at her throat. Her eyes not lifting from the page until she'd finished. Then they lifted, and they found me. She folded the letter as carefully as I had, the night I wrote it, and tucked it into the inside pocket of the coat she still hadn't taken off. I'm not filing for divorce, she said. Not because of the name. Not because of the money. Not because of what you did to the man who tried to take everything from me. Because of what's in this letter. I've spent a year refusing to hear it, and hearing it now, from the man I'd been quietly falling in love with since the morning he first poured my coffee and asked nothing in return. I can't pretend anymore that this was only ever a contract. She stood. Came around the desk. Looked down at me with eyes that had kept me at a careful distance for so long, and weren't cold anymore. She didn't kiss me. Didn't cry. She took my hand. I'm sorry it took me this long, she said. I waited a long time, I told her. A little longer was never the problem. The problem was I never knew how to let you see me without making you a target. I'm done making you a target. I'm done hiding. If you'll have me, you'll have all of it, the name, the inheritance, the years of silence, the letter in your coat. All of it. She told me what she wanted. The morning. The coffee. The hallway between the two doors. She wanted to knock. In the hallway of that house, between the two doors she'd kept shut for so long, Elena Marsh opened mine,